All right, assalamu alaikum, everybody. Welcome back to our third and final installment of this year's Ramadan Halaqa series. We are joined today by Brother Yahaya Halidu, who comes to us. He's in Austin, but originally from northern Ghana. And Brother Yahya is a PhD student in African history at UT Austin. He holds multiple master's degrees and has more than 10 years of teaching experience. He's published in prestigious journals and has received numerous awards, including UT Austin's History Fellowship and Turkish Government Scholarship. So today, Brother Halidu is going to be speaking about the impact of colonialism on Islam and Muslim societies in West Africa. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Brother Yahya.
Jazakallah khairan, my sister Sheikh Shadia Ingram. I really appreciate it. It's a pleasure and a privilege for me to join you. I think about a month ago we met and we left it halfway, so there's the need to make it complete. Inshallah, we'll try our best to make it as lively and productive as possible and short, because people are fasting. I know sometimes because of the Ramadan, it becomes a bit problematic for people to sit for a very long time to listen. Face to face might have been better. However, having said that, do not be frightened by the number of slides. As you can see, most of them are encapsulated with photographs and pictures. Today, I intend taking you into the world of cartography and geography. It is very important to use these pictures and maps, especially to illustrate our point and drive it home for better understanding. Remember when we last met, I made the comment that maps are ideological products of power, prestige, and politics. It is very crucial, therefore, to note that maps, as seen here, would play greater roles or would explain to us how the colonial activities impacted African society in general and Muslim communities, to be specific. Without much ado, I would kickstart. The earlier slide you saw had tendencies of pre-colonial, archaic, ancient, tribal religions or photographs. When you think about Africa, specifically West Africa, in the modern sense, this is what you would see, without doubt. The moment West Africa is mentioned, the first thing that comes to mind is about starvation, war, and religious conflicts or warfare, without any doubt. And so just Google West Africa or Africa, the thing that has to do with modernity, it's exactly what you are seeing on your screen right now. But we would argue that the modern and the pre-colonial, which is better for Africans in the grand scheme of things. Remember, our topic is going to center not just on Africa as a whole, but specifically West Africa. And in West Africa, we are arguing that Islam and Muslim societies have been deeply damaged by excessive onslaught of the colonial enterprise. Now, before we proceed, like I indicated, cartography. Today, we are in a world of geography and cartography. Just look at the three early West African kingdoms from 500 to 1600, way centuries before the arrival of the first missionary or colonial activities, the Europeans, in this case, the Portuguese. Long before they came to the shores of Africa, this was how African map looked like. Africans did not hold or did not conceive of the idea of modern day city-states as found in modern states. Africans at the time thought of their states as empires and kingdoms. And as you can see, there were no artificially drawn boundaries here. You can see ancient Ghana, Mali, and the Songhai Empire. These three empires played crucial roles in the development and sustenance of Islamic societies in present-day West Africa. The reason I thought it wise to start with this photograph. And as you can see the trading route, the source of gold, the source of salt and copper. These were activities that ushered in Arab and Berber merchants to the coastal states of West Africa. And look at the intensive network and trading route that existed long before, I insist, long before the arrival of the first ship or boat of the Europeans to the coast of West Africa. as we would see later, how these activities culminated and complicated relationship between Africans on one side and Europeans on the others against Islam and Muslim-dominated communities. Take a rough guess. Do you remember the film Apocalypto? One would wonder, what is Apocalypto doing in our program today? This is very significant. Mel Gibson couldn't have been right when he directed this film. It is full of valuable lessons that we would learn in this program today. The film Apocalypto, it's about this young gentleman, Jaguapao. It was about the end of the Mayan civilization, where we were told, or we were seen, we were introduced into a vegetative, greenish, lovely atmosphere, one that we are always told about how heaven will look like. These people, locals, indigenes, were enjoying life without outside interference and contact. Thereupon them came excessive raiders who raided their villages, took possessions of their women to be served as concubines and slaves to work on their plantations. And on the other hand, the men were supposed to be used to serve or as sacrificial lambs for their gods. A lot of them died along the way. And when it came to the point of Jaguar, there was a sudden eclipse, as we saw in the movie. And so with the arrival of the eclipse, there was the need to postpone these sacrifices. And so they were made to leave. And they were asked to leave in a game of chess while they were being killed. Jaguar successfully ran back home with his extensive knowledge of the forest vegetation where he came from. And then at the end, we were introduced by the arrival on the shores of a Spanish explorers in their boat and ship. This is exactly the same story that can be told of the African or West Africans in this regard. I would explain briefly what this means. Again, when you see images like this, the first thing that comes to mind is civilization. Ancient, tribal, archaic, not modern. These are all part of the larger picture to show that indeed long before the arrival of the first colonial or the European on the coast of Africa, this was how life was evidently as seen in many West African states. Now, the reason I brought Apocalypto was because of this apt quote, as can be seen, by Ariel and Will Durant, who say, a great civilization is not conquered from without until it has completely destroyed itself from within. This again can be applicable to West African, Islamic, or Muslim-dominated societies. As the talk progresses, we would get to see or know why this exactly is the case. Now, in writing this, both Ariel and Wool were specifically making reference to ancient Roman city-states when they added that the essential causes of Rome's decline lay in her people, her morals, her class struggle, her failing trade, bureaucratic despotism, stifling taxes, and consuming wars. Three things can be applicable to Muslim societies in this instance. One is the decay of her morals by the arrival of the colonial activities. Two, by excessive bureaucratic despotism and its excessive taxes imposed upon the locals. And then three, of course, that culminated into the loss of their business and commerce activities. And then it automatically drive that into consuming lots of wars, as majority of these lessons would be inherent in Islamic societies today with regards to war, conflict, intra-societal violence, and sectarian warfare. For a start, take a critical look at this photo of an African map. Look at the entire upper spectrum, the northern part. It is greenish with a crescent and the star. This signified that long before the arrival, well, this is modern time, Islam has dominated the northern part of Africa, part of West Africa, and the bottom part, which is the southern part of Africa, is dominated by Christian activities. But before the coming of the Europeans, before Africans were enlightened, so to speak, before Africans were introduced to the God of the white man in quote, which is Christianity here, this was how religion was in Africa between the 7th and the 18th century. Between the 7th and the 18th century, as could be seen, traditional African religion took roots. Islam, with the arrival of Islam, culminated on complicated relations in what is known as syncretism and hybridity. The hybridity simply means that West Africans or Islamic African societies tend to blend Islamic and Muslim related activities with their own ATR, which is the African traditional religion. But all this changed with the arrival of the first naval ship on the coast of West Africa. It is deliberate to introduce you to these maps, to introduce you to these percentages, so that we would see how it has shrunk and dramatically affected Muslim societies. These were the three major kingdoms and empires in Africa, with the bigger or the larger chunk being seen known as the West African imperial system, kingdoms and empires. On the right hand, it is Ethiopia. Ethiopia in Islam, Abyssinia, is also very significant in terms of matters of the religion, even during the Holy Prophet's time, where Muslims who were persecuted in Mecca by the Quraysh and the non-believers were being led by Jafar to Negus Nagash in Ethiopia. That is also existent. So they were also introduced or had contact with Islam long once again before the arrival of Christian missionary activities. And then down there, Bantu states, which I would use to illustrate the trading route of how Islam got a stronger foothold within the Far East of Africa. Our concentration is on the West African side. Critically, just look at the map. We haven't seen any artificial drawings there. There were no boundaries. Again, there were no boundaries existing at the time. The reason for the fast spread of Islam to major trading hubs, major rural and city centers at the time. But all this significantly changed once again with the arrival of the first naval ship. Now, Timbuktu, it's known as a city of remoteness and misery, as captured by the French writer. The reason is, he says, salt comes from the north, gold from the south, which is beneath the earth, and of course, luxuries of life comes from the west, in which they named it from the white man. But knowledge, religion, fear, wisdom, and knowing God comes from Timbuktu. This is very significant. This is West African society. Again, hundreds of years, at least more than 500 years before Africans made direct contact with Europeans, Timbuktu was known as a very flourishing Islamic hub. Now, categorically, these are the first images that come to mind when you think about Islamic scholarship. The Dijingeribe Mosque, the Sidi Yahya Mosque, and the Jenny Mosque, all to be found in present or modern day Mali. These were Quranic schools. Remember, during our last interactions, we did mention that this was at a point, these schools, Quranic or Islamic schools, housed about 60,000 students at the time. Imagine between the 7th and the 13th century, 60,000. In modern day universities, even in America or Europe, there are universities that cannot boast of this number. Indeed, it was a hub of intellectual fluidity at the time, but all these are to change in modern times, and we would see why. There are also many twists and turns of first in West Africa. Let us start with the proposition that the very first set of indigenes in West Africa to accept Islam automatically became the first practicing Muslims to reject idol worshipping of African traditional religion. This is one. Conversely, the first set also of Muslims, West African Muslims, to accept Islam automatically became the reasons for the collapse of the then flourishing Islamic states and empires. Isn't this contradictory? When you go down, you would see another dimension, which says when missionary or Europeans came to the coast of Africa, West Africa specifically, they introduced one of the goodies that can be attributed is that they introduced Africans to the concept of Western secular education. However, we argue that the first set of educated elites by both the British and the French automatically became the first to promote and facilitate actively imperial practices for the British. Again, the first set to gain that supposed Western secular education also became the first group to work cautiously to oppose and to undermine colonial rule in Africa. With these two twists and turns of first, it would introduce us to why African societies, Islamic specific, Muslim dominated areas specific, are lacking today because they are nowhere near the conversation with regards to the second category. But with regards to the first category, those who worked to become the practicing Muslims in themselves became adversaries of other Muslim societies. Hence, the saying that they also became the first to start the collapse of the then flourishing Islamic states and empires. There is no ambiguity here. We would see when we come to the inter-sectarian violence that are evident in modern day African societies, today, Islamic societies for that matter. Now let us introduce ourselves specifically before the scramble for impartition of Africa, which started in 1884 specifically, so in historical terms, the 1880s. African map as could be seen, let me use the cursor here, the upper part, which is specifically where our concentration is, West African region. As you could see, it was one hollow desert region. It is often said that Muslims and Arab traders or merchants from the Mediterranean and the Arab or the Gulf regions are usually found within the coastal states of Africa and the desert areas. The reason being, Arabs specifically are nomads. They do not have postal codes and addresses. They wander about wherever they went. They established housing or architecture, stayed there, and then left. They keep on wandering, hence the wandering nomads. Conversely, the Europeans dug deeper and penetrated deeper into the hinterlands of Africa or West African societies, as could be explicated in the map in 1930 categorically as seen. The map dramatically changed, where hitherto known as Islamic or Muslim societies had changed dramatically because of the influence of syncretism. In this case, the arrival, the hybridity we saw earlier, where Africans embraced Islam but did not oppose, because Islam did not oppose certain practices of traditional religion. So it became welcoming. The arrival of Christianity or European missionary activities changed dramatically the spectrum, as we would see later. This was the Berlin Conference, tagged the scramble for impartition of Africa between rival European powers. 7 European powers sat down and drew up a plan to share Africa like a cake among themselves. 1, the British; 2, France; 3, Germany; Belgium; Italy, and of course, Italy and Portugal, who were the first to come. They sat without any representative from Africa, shared Africa among themselves because of their own rival interests at home, because of their own political conflicts that are evident in European societies at the time. And so this scramble or partition of Africa ushered in Africa from the earlier maps, as we have seen, to a completely newly artificially drawn maps. Look at the pre-colonial West African territories we spoke about. These lines, some of them, as could be seen, are just straight lines drawn with a pencil or just with one line. Did not exist in the previous maps as seen. But with the arrival, with the first contact of Portuguese missionary activities, who were explorers, meant that African maps are dramatically going to change. Hence, the ideological product of power, prestige, and politics, the 3 Ps. We would get there. This could be seen as the artificial boundaries that are drawn. When we saw the map earlier, we did not see all these different colorful renditions. It was completely blank, deserted areas. Later, we would explicate why the map is as it is today, as can be seen. This is as close as you can come to the African map in modern societies. Again, look at the middle belt, which case is yellow, the light yellow. This is the area of our concentration. When you see West Africa and South Sudan, Islam had engulfed like bushfire or wildfire across all these areas. Again, with the drawing of these maps, deliberately done to segregate Islamic and Muslim societies, to pitch one tribe against another, to pitch one coastal region against another, meant Muslims were divided automatically. But that was not without blame from Muslims themselves. That was not without blame from believers of the faith of Islam themselves. They played crucial roles into ensuring that this was the case. There's an African proverb that says, when two brothers or siblings fight themselves to death, the stranger will inherit their property. This is the case of Muslim and Islamic societies. Because Muslims were not united, because Muslims were divided, there were warfares, internecine warfares existing at the time, it became much more easier for a third party, an outsider, to infiltrate into their ranks, to divide them and to pitch them against each other. Again, the policy of indirect rule and assimilation by both the British and France, respectively, meant that they pitted one camp against the other, that divide and rule tactics, divide and conquer strategy. If the people are united, you cannot penetrate them. But once they find differences between and amongst them, then it becomes surreptitiously easier for you to penetrate and divide them. Hence, the indirect rule system that was evident at the time. And as seen, this map is the one that is closer to the near accuracy before the drawn up in 1884-85. And these are the principal kingdoms, as can be seen. Majority of them bore Islamic or Muslim names in present times. You can see Audogos, Kumbisali, Timbuktu, Gao, Jenny, Hausa Land, Sokoto, Hausa Bokoy. These are certain things that are picked automatically from the Arabic language and imported into Islamic societies. But this became the Achilles heels of missionary activities in later 18th and 19th century trade when they came to merge with Africans. And these are even before the arrival of Islam, these were how these ancient kingdoms looked like. Again, this is present-day West Africa. This is specifically the result we are going to stop at with regards to this cartography. At least in your minds, you have seen specifically the byproducts of power, politics, and prestige that played into the hands of the European colonialist and missionary activities on one hand, and the lack of unity between Muslim societies on the other hand that helped. Again, let me make the assertion that the Yemenis, the Omans, we would come that to when we see the ancient Swahili coastal states, how it flourished. Who helped West Africa flourished at the time, became the first participant, not the Europeans. Let me repeat, not the Europeans, not the white man in coat, not the Portuguese, neither the French nor the British were responsible for the gradual collapse of Islamic societies or empires. It was rather Moroccan forces who were responsible for the gradual breakdown of Islamic societies systematically, which meant European activities said, oh, once they are divided, it becomes easier. Again, let me send you back to the West African proverb. When two brothers fight themselves to death, it is a stranger who will inherit their father's property. And that was automatically the case in West Africa. It meant they did not have any stronghold to keep themselves united. Now, how did Islam arrive? There is a saying in economic terms that each required what the other possessed, and each possessed what the other required. This is how West Africa and Islamic religion stand in relation to each other. West Africa needed Islam from Arabia, the Mediterranean, and the Persian world to flourish. Islam and Muslims from these three areas also needed West Africa to continue. How did this play out? It was purely economic motivation. They wanted raw materials for their home. They wanted better trading routes to explore the world. Arabs, remember, we mentioned even during the Holy Prophet's time, long before these Europeans came to Africa, meant that Arabs were nomads. They were wandering from one place to the other. And finally, because slavery existed in Muslim or traditional African societies, it made it easier for these Arabs to also have this significant taste for slaves, so that these slaves would automatically be taken to the Gulf regions, the Persian regions, the Mediterranean, the Arab lands to work. But there is something here. 90% of these slaves who were taken by these Arabs were castrated. And again, only 10% of them survived. The reason for the castration of these male West Africans is to ensure that they do not have any sexual relations with Arab women when they are sent to these new places. They were to be ensured that they were the gatekeepers and home servers of these wealthy Arab merchants who were coming to the trading coast of West Africa. And so, as you can see beneath, it wasn't a religious motivation. that brought Arabs to the coast and desert areas of West Africa. It wasn't proselytization, certainly not civilization, as Europeans we would see later, and certainly not God. They did not say we are bringing Mohammedanism, the God of Muhammad, to West Africa. If they did that, they were likely to lose allies in West Africa. It wasn't about B's and C's and G's. We would see what these meant later. It was purely economic reason. Each required what the other possessed, and each possessed what the other required. What did Africans need, West Africans at the time? They wanted salt for preservation of foodstuffs. Salt was non-existent in African coast at the time. They wanted better raw materials also. They were also fascinated, we talked about the last time, three animals which helped spread Islam: the donkey, the horse, and of course, the donkey, the horse, yes, and camels. These three animals helped Africans, West Africans became fascinated with these animals. So it meant they traded better gold, more gold in possession of these animals. And these animals will help African jihads in later centuries to come. They did not talk about God. Hence, the economic terms, Africans required donkeys and camels and horses. Arab and Berber merchants also required raw materials and the rest from this African coastal. Hence, it was an arbitrary, not arbitrary, and a beneficial relationship between both Islam, Berbers on one hand, and West African traditionalists on the other hand, who eventually, because of long-standing trade and belief and trust, eventually accepted Islam. Look at the merchant slave route. Very elaborate, very categorical, how Islam flourished. Look at it from the upper side, from the Swahili coastal areas here in the right, as you can see, deeper penetrating into West Africa. This meant Islam spread quickly, fastly, and easier through merchant activities. Later, which is known as the trans-Saharan trade route, look at the extensive networking. In present times, we would credit Europeans or the Western world for elaborate networking and communication activities. Oh no, these existed long before they came to the coast of West Africa. These were brought specifically by Muslims who believed in the Islamic religion. How did this play out? It meant as the days or weeks or years go by, the slaves or the trade in these activities intensified, and West Africans embraced these Arabs because of building of long-lasting trust. Now, three things, we mentioned this, we wouldn't waste time. The spread to West Africa reinforced the fondness of Africans for architectural, geometric designs and patterns, as seen in the introductory page where Muslim Space Revolutionary Halaqa or Ramadan was seen. You could see the traditional pictures that was existing at the time. In present day, when you go to most European states, specifically England, you are going to see the Westminster buildings that looked exactly like the Jenny buildings. These, in modern terms in academia, would be termed as copyright violations or plagiarism. They plagiarized these activities, architectural drawings from West Africans, who were, of course, influenced heavily by Islamic merchants or Muslim merchants. It meant they took all these things into European city centers or city states. First, it was containment. African kings contained Muslims. They became Muslims. They blended Islamic, and the reform activities was the problem, where Muslims sought to implement Sharia. As you can see in present day Nigeria, northern Nigeria, it is a bigger problem that the nation is grappling with. These were the sources, these were the basis, the roots of these things. Once these West Africans became fascinated with European Arab activities, they said, no, we also have to genuinely look like Arabs or how Muslims or Prophet Muhammad preached. And this in later day would bring conflicts. Now this, as we have seen, in the Mali Empire, Islam took a very strong hold. As you can see, the Ottoman Mamluk Empire, the Kilwa Sultanate, the Hafsid Empire, and Yemen. This was Africa even in the 13th century. Remember, we started from the 7th century. 7 centuries later, Africa was still untouched and had no contact with Europeans. But did it have contact with East? Did it have contact with other areas? Yes, it did. How? Look at all these Eastern African states. known as the Swahili civilization. They played crucial roles. 8 ports were established by Muslims, as can be seen by these Islamic activities. Look at the extensive trading route. In present-day Tanzania, which was known as Tanganyika, Mozambique, Somalia, Kenya, Uganda, and the rest, these were largely dominated areas by Muslims at the time. But the imposition of colonial rule meant all these would be wiped out, as we would see in later day maps. This is how the establishment of trading routes by Muslims in the Swahili coastal areas to the hinterlands of West Africa meant Muslims became united and traded among themselves, which further intensified the spread of Islamic religion across Africa. To be specific, you can see at the bottom, it is bald, like a bald head. Nothing was done at the time. Remember, we made mention of the fact that Islam and Muslim merchants preferred desert areas and coastal states. The reason you can find all these coastal areas up to the north and into the desert areas being inhabited by largely Muslim communities. This is clear map of how you can see. The Oman Empire, like we mentioned earlier, and the Yemenis conquered all these areas and made it wholly, not partly, wholly and uniquely Islamic trading posts and areas, which have significant bearings even in modern times as they speak Arabic. Now, this was how Muslims in West Africa and East African coastal states navigated and interacted with the outside world. They interacted with the Chinese. They had contact with the Indian subcontinent, as can be seen. It was an extensive networking trade route at the time. But the Indians did not attempt at once to colonize. They did not attempt to bring the Hindu or the Buddhism god to them. Neither did the Far East, when you go to the ancient areas of China, neither did they attempt during these interactions to introduce their own forms of worship and God to these coastal areas that were automatically dominated by Muslims and Islamic activities. Now, without even much ado, isn't it erroneous or obvious that right from this onset, with these interactions with the outside world, even before the Europeans, meant that European activities undermined, destroyed, and sought in its own terms to manage activities as can be seen in modern day times. This is the extensive trading route. Remember the one on the right hand, we saw it categorically as pre-colonial empires and states, Islamic states for that matter. As the trading route or as the trade intensified, it means bigger and more areas joined in and became Islamic at the time. But with the sight of this first boat meant trouble was coming to Muslims and Africans. When you see this, situate it with Apocalypto. Apocalypto ended with the arrival of the first naval boat or ship of the Spanish conquerors or explorers. West Africans and Swahili coastal areas, with the sight of this boat, meant trouble loomed to Muslims specifically. Islam and Muslim societies will never ever be the same again with the arrival of this first boat. Why? Because it came along with it a lot of things. Remember the 3 C's we mentioned? The B's and the G's, as we would see later. Hence, introducing us to the conquest or the onslaught of this colonial enterprise. This activity, again, look at the dates, 1884-85. This was the formal meeting that took place in Germany, led by Otto von Bismarck, to divide Africa, especially with regards to rival European powers, as I mentioned, the 7 of them, England, France, Britain, Portugal, Belgium, Italy, and Spain. They divided all these areas among themselves, as we would see why the arrival of that specific Portuguese boat or naval ship meant trouble for Islamic societies. I decided to bring this so that you would see the connection. Americans are very familiar with this, Livingston and Stanley. I will not go deeper because you know this history better than me. This was done before 1884, between 1817 to 1871, a period of about 61 years. Livingston was sent to the coast of Africa, Tanganyika, Tanzania, which again, as we mentioned, was long established or long dominated by Islam and Islamic activities. by the New York Herald newspaper to go and discover, just as Columbus discovered America. Look at this contradiction, to go and discover Tanganyika, when even between the 7th and 13th century, Muslims were existing, Islamic religion was firmly rooted in African societies. Americans into the New World decided to send Livingstone to discover, as in the word discover, Africa, or to discover Tanganyika. What happened? This meant Europeans became jealous of the Americans. No, we have better facilities. We are much more united. America itself is one of our colony. Why should America take the lead in this kind of activities? Hey, let us also take steps into discovering Africa. And the result meant competition was fierce and African societies would be disintegrated. Not just African societies, but Muslim-specific dominated areas. This was the meeting, like a luncheon. Like when Muslim Space invited me, we had good time. This was exactly what happened between 1884, because they were motivated by New Yorkers, Americans at the time, to also venture into the hinterlands of Africa, because we mentioned Muslim activities did not penetrate deeper into the hinterlands. Look at von Bismarck, standing with one leg across the African map. And as the meeting progressed, we would see later, what did they do? They decided to share Africa. Hence the name, they scramble, because Americans came, they also scramble, like Americans scramble fighter jets. They scramble their naval ships to the coast and hinterlands of Africa and then partition it as they wanted without any African representation. The motivations lay deeper in the left bottom hand corner, as you can see. These are the motivations of why these people came. But they hid it under certain things. It is known as the Berlin Conference. Now, with the arrival of these Europeans meant this beautiful present day in quote, as I call it. I do not just call it a mosque in Jenny or Gao or Timbuktu. I call it the Westminster of Timbuktu. Meant these beautiful Westminster buildings were going. Again, with their arrival, they plagiarized. Copyright violations, they took all these things. Yes, on the left hand, the fascination with these animals meant Africans were also going to trade aspects of their lives to the European activities. Look at what they brought. They brought grace to us, to Muslim societies. They brought government and they brought glass, because Africans could see themselves in mirrors and they were also fascinated. As damp as Africans were or taught to be in Western literature, the arrival of glass alone were an African. In modern day selfie, Africans were taking selfie with European-made glass at the time. They were fascinated. Why? They wanted gold. They also wanted to bring gold. Remember when we talked about the arrival of Islam? They did not say this. They also wanted glory. Hence, God, guns, and jinns. The same boat that came with God also had guns and jinns in it. Jinns here meaning alcoholic beverages, and guns here meaning for violence. These two things will play crucial roles in Islamic societies later. Muslims were never introduced to either jinns, which is beer, alcoholic beverage, because it was haram, and it is still haram. And they were introduced to guns, as Muslim societies are disintegrated in modern times. These are the basis for which specific most African or West African Islamic societies were destroyed by these two things. What other things were they destroyed by? They also said they wanted to bring this, as you can see, the government. And the 3 C's here, it is all wrapped in commodities, but they said they wanted to bring Christianity. They were specific. They were clear about their ambitions. They wanted to bring civilization because Africans were not enlightened. Look at the city-states of the coastal areas. Look at the Swahili civilization. Look at Egypt. Look at Bantu. Look at West Africa. All this meant Islamic societies were not civilized. They wanted also to bring commerce, hence Christianity, civilization, and commerce. What other thing did they bring? The boat, the Bible, and the bottle, as we talked. These are specifically done. The boat contained what they call the belief. That is the belief they came with. And then they also came with bullet. And the bullet made sure that there were battles to be fought so that the gunpowder would be useful. Without battles, the bullet would be useless, as in present-day societies. And then, of course, they brought beer to intoxicate Muslims so that they would pick the gun and then fight for the support belief. This is the roots that was built, that was planted in Muslim-dominated societies. Need I say anymore that this alone is enough to wrap up our discussion, that with the arrival of these, the boat, the Bible, and the bottle, it meant what held African societies, as Chinua Achebe says, turning and turning in the widening jar. The falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loose or set upon the world, in this case, West Africa. These things set anarchy to West African societies, and up until from the 19th century to present day, Muslim-dominated societies have never recovered. It is without fear for me to say that this meant African or West African societies dominated by Muslims have never recovered because of the introduction of these materials into the African Muslim societies. Again, this is a meme, as could be seen. They said, oh, 1800s, Europeans, when they realized that Africa, as we saw in the preview map, was full of resources, but Africans have not heard of Jesus. But Ethiopians are Africans, they heard of Jesus. When Muslim societies were existent at the time, they coexisted with ancient Mosaic laws, but they did not hear of Jesus Christ. And so the rest of the world sat and was asking, what are you doing? Again, New York Herald newspaper intensified this campaign and made Europeans envious of its adventure. This was Otto van Bismarck cutting Africa as he liked in the form of a cake. Africa became a toothless bulldog. I specifically brought this elephant to illustrate a point in African proverb, West African proverb, that says, when the elephant falls, there is a big meat for the entire community. The elephant is so huge. It has a lot of meat. It meant the entire community would enjoy this meat for years and years to come. Just think about Qurban during Eid al-Adha. Muslims will slaughter, and it meant households have possession of meat for a very long time. Even households that do not usually enjoy meat, they have abundance of meat for a long time. This was specifically the case when Otto von Bismarck led the scramble for and partitioning of Africa. I do not want to say Africa, but I rather want to say Islam and Muslim-dominated societies, because the impact, it is still felt up until this day. And they say, when two elephants fight, it is the ground that suffers. When Islam and Christianity fight, or when African traditional society fights European missionary activities, the one in the middle is Islam, and it is Islam rather that suffered the fate of all these things. And it was like a chess, as I said, pick and choose, throw the dice, wherever it landed, that was your possession. This was it. Just as an illustration, as you can see the maps of these 7 countries, Spain, France, Italy, England, Britain, England, Germany, Belgium, and Portugal. Because of what is seen on the right hand, they decided to Christianize Africans and to bring God and glory to them. The enduring impact of these activities, I just try summarizing them, is that it disrupted Islamic family values, which were instilled by Muslim activities. It turned kings into enemies. Brothers were fighting each other. It introduced foreign governance system, which meant Islamic clerical activities that were existing at the time in courts and palaces of highly influential kings meant their jobs were deemed redundant. In present day terms, Department of Government Efficiency meant federal workers are sent home. That was exactly the case that happened at the time. It meant colonial activities came with its own governance system, meaning the structure that existed at the time was redundant, and so it had to be abolished. It established many Christian worship centers. It changed what Islamic religion had previously prohibited or permitted. We cannot go into the specifics. We know what Islam has permitted and what Islam has not permitted in terms of even idol worshiping, shirk or bid'ah, in terms of acculturating African traditional religion into Islamic setup, which it did not ban, but Christian missionary activities meant that you can serve only one God. It banned some of these things. And then it brought the taste transfer, Africans' fascination with beer, with guns, with European lifestyle. And then a bigger problem on our head, as this deserves a full program itself, is the introduction of Western secular education. The rest can be managed, but the bottom one becomes the Achilles heels of Islamic societies today. As I wrote to my sister Shadia, that we would also explicate how Muslim distaste for Western secular education is as a result of some of this enduring impact as brought by these societies. Again, Arabic or Ajami or Arab brought language, in which case, even in Surah to Yusuf, it starts by saying, Alif, Ram, Ra, Tilka Ayatul Kitab, Inna anzalnahu Qur'anan Arabiyya la'allakum ta'qilun. We have revealed the Arabic language to you we have revealed the Holy Quran into the Arabic language to you so that you may believe, know it, understand, and have taqwa. But it meant missionary activities would make Arabic language redundant in Islamic and West African societies, as could be seen in the map. It creolized many of these Islamic-related languages, such as Swahili, and acculturated it and indoctrinated it. They gained instruments, access to the instrumentalities of violence. Remember the introduction of the boat, the gun. It meant that all this was going to be a huge problem for Muslim societies. I think my sister is signaling to me that we are getting closer to time. It also brought Muslim societies into the perception of what modern life is, because they viewed certain Islamic activities or lifestyle as archaic, as tribal, as Asian. Hence, the European one becomes the modern. And then, of course, it brought jihad, Islamic revolutions, where jihadists wanted state expansion using the agencies of war, like I indicated. Bullets and the gun became the instrumentalities used by Muslim societies to tear each other. We have a lot to talk, but we would see maybe at another time how this resistance and reform played into the colonial hands. Islam wanted to reform itself. It resisted and wanted reform, but automatically it played deeply into the colonial hands. As we can see, these jihads, the introduction of Boko Haram, Boko simply means book, and haram, book is haram. The introduction of secular education meant book is haram. And then you can see the snowball and domino effect are still felt in Islamic societies up until this day. Is America the leading world, the leading fighter of the war against terror or terrorism? Meant these societies picked the remnant and the cleavages of colonial onslaught up until modern times, where we are still grappling and battling with it. We will talk about this campaign and jihadists. This, like I indicated, deserve full attention on their own. But this jihad ensured that majority Islamic societies and empires were recovered, as you can see, from the hands of European colonialists. But in modern times, this was recently taken. Look at the whole map. All the darker parts are Muslim-dominated societies, once again, who are in conflict. As you can see, the Salafi Jihadi movement in West Africa. This is specific. Why? We did not see this pre-colonial times. We did not see this between the 7th and the 18th century. We did not see this even in the 19th century. But between the 20th and the 21st centuries, all this dramatically changed as a result of the imposition of colonial activities in present-day Muslim-dominated societies. Again, we started with this map. Look at how the map has changed. The map was far bigger than this. Islamic societies or Muslim societies was green all across, but you could see yellow and red that have integrated, which simply means the smear and propaganda campaign that Islam is a religion of violence. Most African societies bought into it. Remember, the artificial drawing of the boundaries meant that some Muslims wanted reform, hence they rejected certain Islamic principles and beliefs. And this has culminated into Sunni-Sunni violence, Sunni-Shia violence, Sunni Ahmadiyya violence, Sunni Salafi violence, which is still felt up until this day. And remember, I would make this bold claim because the literature supports it. The British and the French specifically supported some of these Sufi brotherhood against Salafi activities. Iran specifically supported Shiites to wage wars, specifically in Mali and Nigeria. And of course, Saudi Arabia was not also left off the hook. It meant, remember, the first group of Africans to accept Islam worked to promote it successfully, and the very first group also worked so hard to undermine it. They also sponsored the first group of students who went to Saudi Arabia to study, who came and be tagged as extremists, meaning the Sufi activities that were existing in these dominated Muslim societies was never, ever going to be the same again. And this is the present-day map of traditional Muslim and Christian societies in West Africa. specifically. That is our concentration. The legacy. Sister Shadia would not want me to talk about the legacy, but the legacy is still being felt up until this day. And like I indicated, the conundrum of Western secular education is our bane and Achilles heels in present day societies, which we would have time to talk about another time. And this is where I would draw the curtain to an end. And I hope question and answer comment session, we would even get better time to throw more light on some of those untouched images. Jazakumullahu khairan. Thank you.
Jazakallah, that was, I mean, fantastic. There's so much in there that we can be exploring. I have a couple of questions, and I think there's questions in the chat box. But first, when we talk about when you talk about these different empires within the African continent, pre-colonialism, can you just elaborate a little bit on, is it simply, are these empires, do we differentiate between over the one from another? Because you're saying they have no borders. So what is it that creates an empire? Is it a shared religion, shared language, shared, what ties an empire? Yeah, thank you for going back. Exactly. If you could just elaborate on that just a bit. Oh, you're muted. You're muted.
Sorry about that. I was unmuted. All right. The borders that were existing at the time were tribal borders, ethnic cleavages, not land borders or territorial borders. But it meant history has told us that it always remembers the victor and not the vanquished. And then in historical archiving, whenever an empire or a much bigger influential force conquers another, it establishes its own systems and administrations in place at that place. And those societies become an extension of such empires. The reason African or West African societies who were majority ATR, traditional African religions, and it was tribal. I deliberately started by saying ancient, archaic, and tribal religions. Specifically, the study of religion taught me that these were the case even before religion was established to man. And tribal sentiments, religious ethnicities played crucial role, not religion in the sense of Islam or Mosaic religion or Christianity as we see it in modern terms, but tribal sentiment. And so you could find one tribe or two tribes that existed at the same time. They were divided by language, not by borders. Immigration is a creation of Western activity. Land borders is a creation of Western activities. As you could see, the land was barren. Wherever you went, you were free to establish your settlement as long as you are under the direct control of the reign of the Sultan or the king of that particular locality. The arrival of Islam further intensified these activities around these areas, meaning Islam did not ban these traditional ethnic tribal kings. It did not, including my own country, Ghana. Ghana at the time wasn't even known as Ghana. Ghana was known as the Ashanti Empire. And so they worked with Muslims, they worked with Islam. They were influenced heavily by Islamic or Muslim lifestyle, even in present day terms, even part of their own languages was corrupted with Islamic activities. But between the 7th and the 13th century, this went on until the Berlin Conference, which we are very critical of, which drew these artificial boundaries and lines and pitted one tribe now against the other. It didn't mean Africans were not fighting, no. It didn't mean Africans were not enslaving each other, no. But the chattel slavery and instrumentalities of violence that these societies saw with the arrival of European activities was hitherto never seen or felt or thought of by them. They were merely using bows and arrows or just conquering societies. But the introduction of gunpowder, gun, meant a lot was going down the water. So these boundaries, as could be categorically seen, like I indicated the West Africa from this picture, these were not land or territorial. They were merely identified by their lingua francas, in this case, ethnic or tribal languages.
Perfect. Thank you so much for expanding on that. So yeah, now if we just jumped more to present day, and I know that there's a whole chunk in your presentation that we didn't get a chance to discuss.
That's right.
But you've mentioned numerous times that there was warfare that was weakening the unity of African empires and tribes. And
Correct.
I can't help but think if we look at it today, um, and as the saying goes, if we don't learn from history, we're doomed to repeat it. And
Absolutely correct.
maybe two questions here. One, is this what, when we are now, okay, let's expand a bit. European colonialism not only carved up the continent of Africa, but it did a good number on the majority of what we now call the global South. It creates these borders, which then creates a new sense of tribalism and exclusion
Nationalism.
and competitiveness that is not healthy. And it replaced a system that was much different. For instance, the Mamluk, the Ottoman empires, but they themselves started to weaken. And then again, the stranger comes in and carves it up. Do you have any insight as to how we can move forward, or are we continuing to slip? It seems as though we're continuing to slip down this path as an ummah, be it the ummah that stretches, from West Africa into the Middle East and across Asia, but we're seeing more and more disunity and therefore more and more weakness within for that would continue Western imperialism to really dictate uh, the the functioning of the ummah. So anyway, that's a long way of asking, do you see any hope in unifying, the ummah?
I am always an optimist, but on this basis, I will become a pessimist. Never. We will never ever be united till the end of time. After all, the Holy Prophet himself says, at the end of time, religion, Islam specifically, would be divided into 71 or 72 religions. And that is categorically what we have started seeing even in modern times. So it is very, be it systematic, be it symbolic, one wants to always ensure the other suffers a psychological warfare or violence that renders it incapable of attacking. Again, let me limit this. I wouldn't want to go to the global south or to Europe or to Asia or to Mediterranean, Persian. Let me limit it to the coast of West Africa specifically. In this case, I can pick Burkina, Mali, Niger, Chad, Nigeria specifically, the powerhouse of Africa. Nigeria, as big and as influential as it is always in the news for the wrong reasons. But we will leave that for another day. Let's concentrate on only religious strife and violence. Two, Sufi brotherhoods, the Qadiriya and the Tijaniya, are Sufis. And to all intents and purposes, they helped propagate Islam in West Africa during the 18th and 19th century. Because of certain liturgical and doctrinal differences even in their activities. Never even mind the Salafis or the Wahhabis as they are known there, or Izala. They differ simply even in terms of standing up for prayer, that the Holy Prophet taught us to put our hands this way, whilst others say, no, your hand should be. How does this become a source of conflict? If you want, put your hand this way. If I want, let me leave my hand. How does this become a conflict? Which ensures Muslims pick up arms and guns or violent activities to burn the house of Allah at the mosque that belong to their opponents. That is one. Two, again, in as much as I want to blame inwardness, our own activities, like I indicated, you captured it also rightly, with that African proverb that when two brothers fight, the stranger will inherit. In this case, the stranger is the European colonial activity. Because when the head of a household dies, the house becomes an empty shell. Unity was non-existent in these societies. It meant Britain, as clever as it is, Britain specifically intervened and sponsored one against the other to ensure that these fights continue so that it can have a foothold in the process of arbitrating justice or peace or solving the conflict. But as the Ummah, it doesn't mean even in Austin you are not having differences, but you try to put your differences aside to come closer for the common good of humanity in serving people. As Muslim space says, where you belong. We do not have this in the context of West African sects. No, that doesn't exist. This one will not pray in the other mosque because it is believed that they do bid'ah or shirk or they do hero worshipping. This will not use the kettle or to perform ablution near this person because he belongs to this tariqah. And then you would find Iran and Saudi Arabia axis of power using their influences, sponsoring people with economic motivations to also continue to wage the war. It is not also out of place to say, per the available literature, even 2 months ago, Department of State and American Society acknowledged that part of certain creations of these Al-Qaeda and Boko Haram specifically has the endorsement of the government of the United States. How then do we stop this? It can never be stopped because once American interests are at hand, they would use fair or foul means to sponsor other communities to wage war against the other. So that's, I beg to differ. I am a pessimist in this regard. We can never ever bury these differences. I am fortunate to see, whether fortunate or unfortunate, well, unfortunate, let me rather, to see these conflicts, violent conflicts, with my own eyes as in law, filigri filigranto. I saw it fili with my eyes. I experienced it growing up as a young chap. I saw these violent conflicts in my own neighborhood. Up until this day, performing ablution, standing up for prayer, never even mind the other activities that individuals do themselves, even in terms of materialism, where one is accusing the other of following Christian-dominated charismatic churches, that they are preoccupied with commercial or economic activities to the detriment of their religion. It meant Muslim societies were not allowed to own property. They should be poor and always waiting for aid, US aid, which is cancelled now, to come into such African-dominated societies. We would have common grounds to solve our problems, but we would only pretend to say we are united forever. These differences, as long as humans worship God, as long as Muslims exist, I beg, these differences cannot be wiped out. We can pretend they do not exist to forge forward with what binds us rather than what divides us. But till the end of time, that division would continue to be the case. That is the problem with West African Islamic societies. And like I indicated, this is even Sufi. Then we come to Sufi Sunni. We come to Sufi Shia. We come to Sufi Ahmadi, which is generally believed to be the creation of British imperial practices. Does that ring a bell? Ahmadis specifically are not even considered in quotes as Muslims within the West African sub-region because they believe it is solely a creation of imperial powers. How then does this conflict? They call themselves Muslims. You call yourself Muslim. Why don't you find the common ground? They say no. Once the basis, the foundation is weak, the entire heart is also weak. So they cannot coexist or sit on the same table with such people who practice bid'ah, shirk in their own words. It's a challenge. It's a challenge. But we dare advocate that it is better to see our commonness, our common grounds as Muslims, even as humanity, rather than dwelling so much on the differences. But the differences will exist though. Even husband and wife have differences at home, but they learn to coexist. And that the teeth and the tongue both live in the same place. Occasionally, you would find the teeth biting the tongue. As painful as it is, they learn to coexist. And that the crocodile and the fish both live in water, but they coexist, even though there are violent conflicts that exist. Let us find our common grounds as Muslims and leave what divides us. What divides us, as long as they are individual, it is the individual with his own Allah or with his own God. Even during Prophet Muhammad's time, what did they say? قل يا أيها الكافرون لا أعبد ما تعبدون ولا أنتم عابدون ما أعبد ولا أنا عابد ما عبدت ولا أنتم عابدون ما أعبد. No compulsion. Just let the human being be. Live and let's live. Do yours, Allah would be pleased. Let me do mine. But we are all Muslims. We belong to the same Islamic religion. Let's not our differences continue to divide us. It makes it easier for the infiltrator to penetrate. That is the problem.
Yes, you're right. And I was hoping that you could you'd come with this great optimism, but you are a real. I wouldn't call you a pessimist. I would say that you are a realist in this. And I think that the issue is that we tend to look at, others as, well, you're Muslim and I'm Muslim, or you belong to this sect or I belong to this sect. when in reality, we're trying to align ourselves with the imperialists, whether they're British, whether they're European, whether they're Muslim, quote unquote Muslim imperialists, and forgetting that it's us on the ground versus the elites that are really causing the division. But
Absolutely.
that again, we could go on that topic for quite some time. But I do want to
Yes,
get to the couple of
that
questions.
alone deserves,
Yeah.
with secular education, a differentiation.
Absolutely. So first question in the chat box is, the question is, wasn't alcoholic beverages always a feature of indigenous cultures? What was different about alcoholism that colonialism introduced?
Okay, the fact with regards to these Muslim-dominated West African societies specifically, and the Swahili coastal states, is that they were never introduced to this kind of alcoholic beverages before the arrival of the European. That also becomes many of the first. Yes, there are intoxicants that exist in cultures, even with regards to food. For example, when we go to Ghana specifically, or West Africa again, we have the popular food fufu, we have banku, we have kenke. These are all gotten or done, prepared through flour. The flour is usually put to ferment, and this in itself can be called or known as an intoxicant. But that is in a different sense with what the Europeans introduced to Africans, especially the ones in bottles. It came with the ones in bottles, which Africans became so fascinated. Some smelled good. The taste, that was why we named it taste transfer. The Europeans sought to transfer this taste to the Africanist. And once that was the case, they became so fascinated that they drank. It wasn't for nothing that the Holy Prophet also banned that intoxicant. When you become drunk, you will lose your sense of self. The other things that would follow are not going to be virtues, they are going to be vices. You would commit al-fasha, you would commit murder, you would commit other, well, gambling and whatever, they are there in larger quantities. And so the difference here, yes, it is true, Roshana, it is true that every culture, every empire had its own unique indigenous taste. But the one that was introduced, the Arabs never introduced any intoxicant. The Turks from the Mediterranean, the Persians, the Mamluks, the Omanis, the Yemenis did not introduce any form of intoxicant to Muslim societies. Remember what we talked about. Each required what the other possessed. Each possessed what the other required. They did not, neither did they possess alcohol, nor did they require alcohol. Africans didn't require that. But the Europeans, without asking, brought it in larger quantities, knowing that when they became intoxicated, they were sure to lose their lands, they were sure to lose their religion, and they were sure to lose their dignity and sense of rationing and thinking. Hence, it became much more easier to use bottles and the Bible and the books to convince them.
Well, thank you for that explanation. That what was existing in that time was not to the degree that what the Europeans brought.
Yes.
The next question in the chat box is, can you please touch on Mensa Musa? Was he as wealthy as claimed by many historical legends? How did Mali or Timbuktu get so wealthy in the Middle Ages?
In fact, he was more wealthier than was reported in the literature. Remember again, history remembers the victor, not the vanquished. And you do not expect, with the prejudices and the biases of European writers, to include this world because they had never before seen it. Today, Americans and the whole globe agree Bill Gates is a rich man, collectively, right? Okay. Elon Musk, despite what he's doing, let's put that aside, is a rich man in his own state. And of course, Steve Jobs, on and on and on, they are. These modern day billionaires or trillionaires, as you can classify them, do not have 1% of the riches of Timbuktu or Mali or Gao under Mansa Musa's reign. Never ever. It was an unbalanced, it was an underreported and never before seen wealthy. The Arabs are categorically known to be wealthier, but even they were left flabbergasted, shocked at how Mansa Musa exhibited the panache, the audacity to keep throwing gold and dust as he walked and to keep dashing them to people as he made his triumphant entry into Mecca during the pilgrimage for his Hajj. It was not for nothing he went along with a reported 130,000 followers. 130,000 followers between the 7th and the 13th century. Even today, you sponsoring one person to Houston, you would complain. To Mecca, you would complain because of exorbitant fare prices. But Mansa Musa transported 130,000 followers to do the Hajj. It was underreported when it was merely said in the literature by European writers that because of the exuberance and the way and manner, the fluency he did with gold, the prices of gold came tumbling down for centuries, at least for 100 years. The price of gold never recovered because of the benevolence of Mansa Musa. So indeed, he was far, far richer than even was reported. We do not expect Western or European travelogues, distant biographies, to capture it as it was. But remember what I indicated about even Westminster. If there was nothing good to learn from Muslim or Islamic societies in West Africa, they wouldn't come to copyright and plagiarize Islamic buildings and send it to the European coastal states. That is one. Two, you also ask about how did Mali or Timbuktu get so wealthy in the Middle Ages? Number one, through gold. Remember when I started by saying they said salt and spices come from the north, but gold, copper, silver comes from the south, which is from the ground. West Africa is imbibed in its rich natural resources. Gold, even today, is expensive. African kings today, in modern times, adorn themselves in gold regalia. They are not gold dust. They are not plated with just gold colors. No, they are in fact gold. Let me go back to the first picture, as you would see of him in the bottom left-hand corner. This is Mansa Musa here. And it was said even in his own room or his lounge where he welcomes visitors, all the ground, as we see today in our mosque, in our masajids, in our homes, carpet, the carpets are spread with gold. You were stepping on gold as you moved past. That was how rich the Malian Empire was. And that was why Arab merchants sought also to get there to have this gold. Also know the fondness or the excessive desire for gold between Arabs also. They also value gold even in present times. At least their women value gold, whilst the men value copper and silver. So gold was the predominant thing. Of course, in later centuries, Europeans used cocoa, which are used to make chocolates and certain beverages in modern times. So these two things, of course, petroleum at the time, Africans did not possess the technological know-how to remove petroleum or to dig for oil from the ground. Again, it was the coming of the Europeans that taught Africans that they were sitting on riches, they were gold, they were oil, they were this and that. But gold was predominantly the rich commodity of these Islamic dominated communities, even in present times. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for that. Any other questions from those that are with us right now? You guys are good. Okay. Okay, great. I want to just ask you one last thing as we close
Yes.
out. There are no shortages of books that are very Eurocentric, especially even when we're looking at the legacy and history of the African continent. We read a book a couple of months ago just in our book club, and I'm sure you know the book because it's probably the most well-known book centered on African society called Things Fall Apart, the novel by us. Um,
Chinua Achebe.
yep. But can you just, off the top of your head, are there authors, books, resources that people who are interested in knowing the true history of the African continent can go to, can look to get a better, more accurate historical understanding of the region? Be it even if you just wanted to focus on West Africa, That's perfectly sufficient. Africa
We
is no
have a lot.
small continent.
We have a lot. Not least, we have Bruce Hall, who wrote on a history of race in Muslim West Africa between 1600 to 1960. A history of race in Muslim West Africa by Bruce Hall. The same author also has a book, The Roads of Timbuktu, Trade, Empire, and Islam in West Africa. The same author again has Africa and the Atlantic World. Then we also have that touched on education, Sufism, history, religion, and Islam broadly in West Africa, Timbuktu and the Songhai Empire by John Honwick. We also have another book by David Robinson entitled Muslim Societies in Africa. Then we also have The History of Islam in Africa by Nehemiah and Randall Powells. Nehemiah Lefzion has written extensively on Africa. Then we also have one of our own here in America, Rudolf Ware, who wrote on the Walking Quran, Islamic Education, Embodied Knowledge and History in West Africa. Then we have Shin Hanrita, who is in Northwestern University, who wrote on Islam and Social Change in French West Africa, History of an Emancipatory Community. Shin Hanrita at Northwestern University. We also have Charlie English, who wrote on the Book Smugglers of Timbuktu. Book Smugglers of Timbuktu, the quest for this storied city and the race to save its treasures. This is an interesting read, especially with regards to the question being asked about Mansa Musa. Charlie English wrote The Book Smugglers of Timbuktu, the quest for this storied city and the race to save its treasures. We also have one of West African, Malian, Osman Omar Kane, who wrote Beyond Timbuktu, an intellectual history of Muslim West Africa. Then we have one of our own from the Swahili coastal state, Ali Mazrubi, who also wrote on Africa's Islamic experience, history, culture, and politics. Ali Mazrubi, Africa's Islamic experience, history, culture, and politics. Then we also have The African Dominion by an American, Michael Gomez, who wrote A New History of Empire in Early and Medieval West Africa. Michael Gomez has written extensively on Islam in America. I've read a lot of his books. We also have Ibrahim Suleiman, who wrote The African Caliphate, the life, works, and teachings of Sheikh Usman Danfodio between 1754 and 1817. The good thing about all these things is that it has chronicled these histories using primary sources long before the arrival of Europeans, as we have said. Then we also have One Woman's Jihad, Nana Asmau, scholar and scribble. At least the feminine side is not also left out. This is an interesting read about the feminine side of Islam in West Africa. Then we also have Muslim Societies in Africa, a historical anthropology by Roman Lomier. A historical anthropology, Muslim societies in Africa. Then we also have another one by Sheikh Anta Babu, who is also a professor at Pennsylvania here, who wrote on Fighting the Greater Jihad, Amadou Bamba and the founding of the Mourdia of Senegal between 1853 to 1913. Founding of the Mourdia of Senegal, Amadou Bamba, Fighting the Greater Jihad. Maybe I should even send the list to Shadia rather than reading them. I don't know if you are taking note. It will be too much to take note. Maybe that would be better. I would send the
That
list.
would be great because I was going to
Perfect.
rely on the recording to go back and put the list. But if you have
I
the
will
list
send the list to
accessible,
you.
that
I
would
will
be
send the list to you.
fantastic.
Yes. Sending the list would be better, I guess.
Inshallah, inshallah. And of course, I would assume at some point you will have a book to add to this wonderful list.
A lot.
And be sure to let us know.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, Brother Yahya, oh, maybe one more question here.
Yes.
Yes, okay. So is the African debt crisis artificially created by Europeans? Any thoughts on this? Ooh, I like this question.
I like it as well. Again, let's not be quick to blame everything on the Europeans. I am an optimist. I am an Africanist scholar, student of history, but we are also humble enough to acknowledge our excesses, just as we have acknowledged our excesses as Muslims. Larger continent of Africa, yes, we cannot. 50, 60, 70 years after colonial rule had officially ended, many African nations have attained independence. Yet We still point accusing fingers at the white man or the colonialists or the Europeans. No. Yes, some of the legacies are lasting. They are like a scar. That scar gel does not wipe easily. Yes. But there should come a point where conversations will need to be had that, hey, this is where we put the colonial activities to a stop. We have to take responsibilities for our own actions and inactions. The debt officially, yes, are created, as you know, World Bank, Bretton Woods institutions, IMF. They do not do any good to any state, be it African or Asian. There is nothing good about IMF loans. There is nothing good about World Bank supporting you. There is indeed nothing good about US aid. So indeed, United States canceling US aid, to be frank, in the long term, it will not affect Africans specifically. In the short term, it would only affect corrupt African politicians. That is where the bane of our problem is. So the problem might have started with the European artificial creations, with loans, hiding under the category of development, just as the Marshall Plan, just as United States of America sought to do to Europeans to rebuild European cities after ravishing themselves in World War I and World War II. America, as a bystander, decided to come with the Marshall Plan to help European activities also. Reconstruction, it was good, but it did not come with a cost to Europeans. It is the same way these loans or debt crises started with Europeans, but it ended with Africans. There is a book that was recently written by two African professors, Falola and Olajumoke, Africa's Big Men. That is the title. Predatory state-society relations. The concept of big man politics in Africa has far outshadowed or outshined what problems that are created by these Europeans. 50 years of independence. Ali Mazrui, like I indicated, in the year 2010-2011, wrote a book, 50 years is enough. They organized a symposium on Africa. 50 years is enough. At least we have come to the threshold. Enough is enough. The enduring historical, political, economic, lasting legacies are there, granted. We agree. But at what point do we take responsibilities to say, let us do it our own way? Let us do it the way things are done outside there. But instead, politics, bigotry, ethnicity, tribal sentiments, and of course, religion are used to divide and to ensure others perpetuate their way to power. When a thief is caught or when a corrupt politician is being investigated by the state, you would find tribal and ethnic groups demonstrating, protesting for the release. That yes, we do agree he's a thief, but he's one of our own. Leave him alone. How do we develop with this kind of mentality? Religion is used to further divide the people for political expediency. As long as religion, Islam, Christianity is used, we will never be able to continue on this debt. The debt will continue to pile. Monies that are meant for schools to be built, for hospitals, for healthcare, for better roads, for electricity, for communication, for better trade networks, are instead diverted into the pockets of these predatory Africa big men. They are diverted, surprisingly, to Swiss bank, many European banks, and of course, New York, Wall Street, or banks here. You give us the money, we intend come to save the money in your own offshore accounts, and Africa continues to remain underdeveloped. No, we cannot blame the white man. No, we cannot blame the European. We have to look inwards. Africans are their problems in modern times, not the lasting legacies of colonialism per se. We pride ourselves in coming to terms with democratic rule. After all, Lincoln said to a far more divided continent than ours that let us see eye to eye with what binds us rather than what divides us, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people will not perish from the earth. This is what Africans have chosen also. Democracy. Democracy is not without its own problem. Democracy has ensured that African politicians are as corrupt as the word itself, who perpetuate, who continue to propagate, who continue to use tribes to rally against one. You will not win an African election in democracy if you do not belong to the largest tribal or ethnic group. So instead of calling it democratic or electoral vote, we should rather call it a census of tribes to see which tribe outweighs the other. And so this debt, Rwanda, let me give you an example, has paid off its debt. How did it do it? Rwanda has banned ethnicities and tribe because of what was experienced in 1994, the genocide. An identity card of a Rwandan will not read Tutsi or Hutu. It simply reads Rwandan. Nothing about ethnicities. They have rallied under one leader. They have paid off their debt and say, hey, we do not need any loans or USAID or IMF or Bretton Woods institution or World Bank loans. We can develop with the rich natural resources. Louis Farrakhan here, one of your own here, said in Ghana that no, you cannot blame the white man, you cannot blame the European. You have the riches, you have the gold, you have the what, the mineral resources that brought Europeans are still in Africa, but they are not owned by Africans. If they are at all, they are 1% because they have sold their conscience and the heart of the nations to wealthy European merchants and transnational companies. And so why do we blame them? We have to look inwards. It is not surprising that you see, again, surprisingly, I do not want to touch that, coup d'etat, dictatorial tendencies, and authoritarian regimes have taken root in West Africa. Not East, not South, not North, but West Africa. At least you can mention within the past 3 years, more than 12 coups have taken, successful coups have taken place in West Africa alone. You can talk about Burkina Faso, you can talk about Mali, you can talk about Niger, Guinea, and on and on and on. And they are going. Mali, of all places, are under military rule as we speak now. And they say they do not want to have anything to do with colonial systems of governance. Neither do they even have something to do with African Union or the Economic Community of West African States, the sub-regional bodies, because they believe these are stooges and pounds being used by Europeans or Western corporations to perpetuate. But is dictatorial tendencies or coup the result? No, they might not be, but they explain deeper into the heart of the problems why these leaders, people feel discontent that money is meant for projects to alleviate the poverty of ordinary citizens are diverted and siphoned by these politicians. So politicians are the problem in Africa. Number one, they are responsible for this debt crisis that continues to pile. Not the ordinary citizens, but they use this through the conduit of tribes and ethnicities and, of course, religion and regionalism to divide the people. Just as that is why we said in the presentation, gaining access to the instrumentalities of violence was that Africans tend to be more ruthless, quotidian of violence than even what the British or the French taught them. They learned from them. They have monopoly of this violence and they dominate their societies more than their societies were dominated by the arrival of Europeans. And so how do we blame them? On one hand, the gunfire, the gunpowder, the bullets, the gun we talked about. Yes, they were European creations. They were brought by Europeans, but Africans tend to use them now. As we saw in the introductory picture I told you, when you think about, I didn't say West Africa, Africa. I said West Africa specifically. When you think about this is modern West Africa for you. Nothing but war. Nothing but war, military takeovers, coup d'etat, fighting civilians, killing, displacement, and on and on. The result is that women specifically and children suffer the brunt of this. Women are raped and displaced, and a whole lot. I don't want to go deeper into that. But Africans have their own problems in contemporary terms. The enduring and lasting legacies of colonialism cannot be doubted. They are there. But at which point in time do we say enough is enough? Let us take our destiny into our own hands to ensure our people are alleviated, their plights are taken care of. We always go cap in hand begging to the doorsteps of these Western or European institutions, which does not inure to the benefit of the citizenry of Africa.
Um, you know, that's gives us a sense of sort of a disheartening outlook, but inshallah things will change. I do have one question, maybe a little expansion on that. I know that China has been investing quite a bit, maybe more so in Eastern Africa than in Western Africa, Are the African leaders, are they falling into a trap, in your opinion, by allowing the Chinese to come in and help develop their countries?
Thank you very much, Sister Shadia. This is absolutely a great question. No, they are not. It is deliberate, it is consciously done, it is out of necessity. And I very much like it, you have said it in your question. They might not be so in West Africa, but they are so in East. Remember, once again, the East is dominated by Islam, by Muslims. The reason for the domination is that West Africans are still strangulated. They are tied or handcuffed by Britain and the United States of Africa, West Africans. And France. France has a complete foothold on French West African countries, with the exception of Ghana and Nigeria and Gambia, Sierra Leone, these four countries. All the countries in West Africa are French West African colonies. And France has a complete grasp and domination over this. The reason it chooses who should be the leader and otherwise. Elections are sham, just to tick the box that elections have been held. But democracy does not really work as it should in these areas. Because France, Britain, and America have a complete foothold with military bases. America has a military basis. French has a full domination of economic and political. Britain has tended to cede and only interferes when necessary as compared to the France. So the Chinese are finding it extremely difficult to penetrate because of the presence of these three axes: France, Britain, and America. America specifically, if it were left with France and Britain, China would have taken over. But the presence, the challenge, the rivalry between America and China meant China would stay clear. But they have a couple of projects, including even in Ghana. But their project, surprisingly, it's that because it does not come attached with conditions to democracy and human rights, African leaders tend to embrace them. But Europeans or America comes with conditions of improvement of human rights. Whether that is true or not, that is another discussion for another day. It comes with the condition of improving democracy. It comes with the condition of promoting feminism and promoting other things I do not want to say, which Africans tend to fight back or push back against. But the Chinese are wise. Like you said, if we don't learn from history, we are bound to repeat and fall. So the Chinese picked from that page, they picked lessons, valuable lessons from the mishappenings and the fall of France, Britain, and America in West Africa. Instead, they said, no, ours is economic, bilateral, barter. We give you this. They are even benevolent enough in some instances to give 10, 20, 50 years to repay the loans. How can you use 50 years of your existence as a sovereign nation to pay back loans? But that is what the Chinese are doing. In the event that there are lapses or you fail to meet your side of the bargain, they seized. A clear case is the one in Zambia, where they seized a complete government house, where it housed the state house, including the airport. It is owned by the Chinese because they have built roads, copper belt, they have built a lot of things. It comes with economic motivations, not political, not democracy or human rights. But when you falter and do not pay, they receive those possessions and intend run it. So as long as America and Europe specifically continue to bother Africans about democracy and human rights, China would continue to have a strong foothold. But that doesn't mean African leaders should not reform, should not take human rights seriously. But whether the human rights as advocated by Europeans and Americans specifically is what Africans need is also a debate for another time. But indeed, Africans also need to improve on the quality of life of their citizens. China, as long as Africans do not care about China interfering in its political affairs, they would always go to them, including my country, Ghana, that is being used as a model of democracy in Africa, the entire Africa. When Americans are going to talk about a pure democracy or an exemplary democracy in Africa, Ghana is number one. You wouldn't go far without mentioning Ghana. Certainly Nigeria would not come close. But Ghanaians are also wise, or the political class. They want to play both. You cannot have it both ways. And once the Americans, they say when America coughs, the whole world catches cold, Africa specifically. Once America rumbles and blinks the eye, they say, no, 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 no. We are only doing this. They try to always issue disclaimers when America tries to. So West Africans can usually not enter into these bilateral agreements with China except with the endorsement of America. They do not care about Britain and France. And so if you find Chinese elsewhere, it means America has either milked that place dry or there's nothing left for the Chinese, then they allow them to step in. But this is an interesting thing. But with regards to East Africa, it's a completely different ballgame altogether because of the heavy influence of Islamic presence and because it is also closer. Let me go back to that East African picture for you to see it clearly. You would see how the trading routes explicated all this. Yes. Look at this. This is much more closer to China and India than it is closer to Britain or France or the United States. The trading route we saw, it is just closer to the Indian Ocean. Once the goods are packed from Zanzibar, Kilwa, and the Mozambican island, they go quickly to India. Once it enters India, that is closer to China. This is how the trading activities are. So they tend to be closer by way of necessity. Yes, these are the trading route. As you can see it clearly, it is easier to transfer these goods to India and China. So it is also easier, even if no-fly zone is being passed by Europe and America and its allied to prevent Indians and Chinese from flying, they use the water bodies, which is theirs, rather than it is in their control, rather than in the control or in the hands of European naval ships or fighter jets or what have you. So the reason this Swahili civilization or coastal states have become much more closer to China than West Africans have become, because the water bodies are not evident there except the Pacific Ocean that you will pass through. But with regards to this Indian Ocean, no. While the Atlantic Ocean is also closer to West Africa, but it meant you still have to pass through Indian Ocean before getting there. So it becomes easier for East Africans than it is for West Africans because of the presence of America.
Absolutely fascinating. I really can't thank you enough for this talk. It is one of the more unique, I think, presentations that we've had simply because it's on a topic that is so rarely discussed. And so I especially appreciate you taking the time to be here to share your wisdom and your knowledge with us. And I know that you have more slides, so inshallah, we will find out a time to continue this
Well, I'll tell you
conversation.
so you wouldn't forget. Well, this is specifically the jihads that you talked about unity, you talked about
Yeah,
pessimism and optimism. We would see when we discuss this at another time whether the road is clear.
yeah.
And of course, what is dear to me in present time is about education. I remember when I came to Muslim space, I told you, it doesn't need bombs like the Americans dropped in Tokyo or in Japan.
Mhm.
It doesn't need bombs in Afghanistan or to bomb the Islamic State in Iraq and Iran and Syria. No, it doesn't need that to destroy a nation. It only needs education to either bridge the gap or to collapse. When the education system is corrupt, be sure the adherents, the followers, or the students this education system is going to produce out of is going to be problematic, as we would see later.
Yeah. Well, for sure. For inshallah, you and I offline, we will figure out a time to continue this conversation because we can't leave everyone hanging on this. It is far too
But it's
valuable.
good to let them hang in so that they will not become overly bored with the presentation.
No, no, it's a lot to absorb. And so I think it's great that we'll break it down into a few sessions. But inshallah, again, thank you so much. And it's Ramadan and you've taken, hours of your day to be here, plus the preparation. So
It is worth it.
we are
Once it
absolutely
is
indebted to
Islam,
you.
once it's for our Muslim brothers and sisters, wherever duty calls, we would answer, inshallah.
Alhamdulillah, Alhamdulillah. Well, brother Yahya, thank you for being here. Inshallah, we will have you back to continue this conversation. But I truly appreciate all that you've done, and you are a true gem to have part of of the wider community, not just Muslim space, but the wider Austin community, the wider American community, and beyond. So please, I ask Allah that you continue to be blessed, that you are shown great success, you and your wife and your beautiful children. Nothing but goodness and blessings from here on out. But with that, everyone, we'll close it. And I hope you all have a fantastic rest of your Sunday, our last Sunday, inshallah, of Ramadan. Eid is around the corner, so make the most of these last few days. Thank you, brother.
Thank you very much, sister. I wish you the very best also, and it is a pleasure for inviting me to share aspects of our research also. It does help. It does make us better students, better followers, and bridges or intensify the fluidity of interaction between us also. I do truly appreciate it. And may Allah also abundantly reward your efforts at bringing Muslim souls together. And then in the spirit of Muslim space, where you belong. I truly belong here.
Thank you. Ameen, ameen, ameen. Thank you, everybody. Assalamu alaikum.